During this period, there were no schools, there were no books, and no assignments. Children were often sent to different families in a process called fosterage, where they would learn new practical skills. The boys were taught how to herd animals, hunt, and ride a horse, while the girls were taught how to cook and sew. Monasteries were of the first schools in Ireland. They began around 580. Although they housed mainly monks, many people, including students, traveled from all over Europe to come and learn in them. It was in these monasteries where many books were scribed and preserved, including the Book of Kells. Children, like adults, were experiencing a time of economic and religious changes, and they were often seen as a means to promote the Protestant religions through their early institutions. In the 17th century, when King William passed the penal laws, many of them affected the school system, with laws that Catholics couldn't be teachers and that it was illegal for a child to attend a Catholic school. Because of these laws, many Catholic parents set up secret schools called hedge schools, where the children could still be taught under their Catholic religion. Most of the teachers in these schools were men. Common things taught were math, reading, writing, Greek, and Latin. It was also common for these schools to house young and old students. After the laws ended, many of these schools kept on as private schools. Most of them were up until the 1880s. A school paid for by the government didn't exist until the 1830s. Until this, school needed to be paid for by the parents. The Kildare Play Society was set in place in the early 1800s to help poor children still afford an education.
In 1831, the national school system was set up and Christian churches had main control. There was a new education system of non-denominational education for all Irish children. They tried to separate from religion, but it didn't work. In Ulster, Presbyterians were strongly opposed to the new system. In the 1830s, the Synod of Ulster passed a resolution rejecting it. And in Presbyterian areas, schools were burned and teachers were intimidated. This forced the National Board to allow schools the power to exclude the clergy from other denominations, because if the board refused, the teachers would have stopped their schools from becoming national schools and the whole system would have collapsed. From 1831 to 1965, there was the principle of mixed education, which remained the keystone of the national school system, and there were the rules of the National Board. The board was in charge of the combined moral and literary instruction, while the patron of each school would determine the form and content of religious instruction. Teachers earned money for each pupil that attended more than 100 times, mainly teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, with boys being taught agriculture and girls being taught geography, needlework, and domestic work. From the 1900s to 1920s, there was the abandonment of the payment by result scheme for teachers. This was replaced by a salary scheme and less restriction on the curriculum. Drawing, science, physical education, and manual instruction were introduced into the curriculum, and there was a more child-centered approach with more interest in early education. This led to more financial and human resources being invested into education in the 1960s.
In the early 20th century, Irish education was heavily influenced by religion and required fees to attend. The Irish system remained different to other parts of the United Kingdom. Whilst England and Scotland had denominational schools, local authority controlled Ireland's schools. Radical reform was set up in 1922 in the form of the Green Paper. This paper had 6 aims. Most notably, they aimed to establish greater equity and broaden education for students on a national level. The decades of the 1950s to 1960s were the most progressive in terms of Irish education, with significant policy change and reform. In 1950, the Council of Education was introduced, an integral body that improved the availability and quality of education. Additionally, the fundamental rules were revised by the Minister for Education in 1965, including the drafting of Rule 68, which determined that religion classes were still a necessity at primary level. From the 70s to the 90s, curriculum in Ireland had taken on a new form. The state recognised the denominational character of schools on a nationwide level, including Catholic schools, and the syllabus was offered to integrated religious beliefs that were previously secular.
Despite the growing racial, religious, and cultural diversity of Ireland, most primary schools remain denominational. Majority of the students are white, Irish, and Catholic. As of 2015, the average percentage of non-Irish pupils in schools is 11.1%. 23% of these schools accommodate 4 out of 5 immigrant children throughout the country. In the Celtic Tiger era, there has been a significant increase in immigration to Ireland. Due to race and religion-based notions of Irish identity, the influx of non-Irish immigrants has caused a great deal of tension. Between the years of 1995 and 2004, over 400,000 non-Irish people migrated to Ireland. This dramatic shift in Ireland's demographic marks the transition of Ireland into a more multi-ethnic state. Recent patterns in immigration have required the state to quickly adapt to increasingly high levels of diversity within the education system. Although the Catholic Church is allowed to govern schools according to their beliefs, the Equality Act of 2004 still requires them to respect the cultural diversity of their pupils. It is argued that the state's educational policies are grounded in the concept of Irish identity, which tends to emphasize whiteness and positions immigrants of color as other. Although there is implicit bias amongst educators, there have been many teachers who have expressed concern in terms of being able to provide sufficient emotional support for these children. While the Irish education system may have a long way to go, it is safe to say that we will see more culturally sensitive policies and behavior in the near future.